Fast Food Masquerade is one of the most dull, uneventful, and prosaic indie animated projects I have ever seen. But if you put in the mental effort and juxtapose this episode with your own life, you might just see an episode filled with confidence, sincerity, and emotional depth. I'm going to go over a summary of the events that happen within this episode, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode begins with Jax accidentally breaking Gangle's mask as Ragatha is trying to teach her baseball, starting an argument between the two, and Zubul tries to cheer Gangle up by giving her a plastic happy mask that won't break as easily. The entire cast is then summoned by Kane as he has a new horror-themed adventure planned out, but Pomni intervenes and asks if they can do a non-horror themed adventure instead. Kane remembers that they have a suggestion box for the adventures and digs through it, settling on an adventure where everyone works at a fast food restaurant and Gangle is the manager. As usual, Zubul tries not to participate, but Kinger brings up that he can sit this adventure out so Zubul can participate in his place, but before Zubul can argue that logic, Kane forces Zubul into participating and Kinger ends up staying behind. Once everyone is at the fast food place, they set up for the morning shift. Jax, upset with the choice of adventure, begins to harass Ragatha, and to get him to behave, Gangle asks Kane to set up punishments at the end of each adventure to incentivize everyone to behave themselves. One of the first customers asks for a stupid burger, which has a sauce on it to make the customer stupid, and while Ragatha is preparing it, she gets some of the sauce in her eye, turning her, well, stupid. The next customer to arrive is none other than Gummy Goo, who Pomni is excited to see again, but despite her best attempts at trying to be friendly with him, he has no recollection of their past interactions, so all her efforts are tragically in vain. The cast continues on with their shift as Pomni, Jax, and Ragatha all question Gangle's authority at one point or another, leading to Gangle becoming depressed, despite her having her happy mask, and when Pomni confronts her about it, she dodges talking honestly about her feelings, and continues to act happy. As the day comes to a close, each character one by one leaves as their shift ends, leaving only Gangle and Pomni together, and Pomni, out of an act of pity for Gangle, covers her shift so that Gangle can leave early. Once Gangle leaves, she takes off the plastic mask and throws it away, and gets run over by a car, snapping her out of the adventure to be evaluated by Kane, who gives her, and the rest of the cast, a passing grade. Gangle, now feeling like everyone hates her, isolates herself, but Zubul comforts her, saying that she's still her friend, and the episode ends with Zubul walking alongside Gangle as they go to rejoin the group. In my last review for The Amazing Digital Circus, I put a heavy emphasis on how well the Mystery at Mildenhall Manor succeeded at giving us grounded and calm character interactions, and Fast Food Masquerade feels like an entire episode comprised of those moments. For the first time ever, we see Zubul participate in an adventure, and she's okay. In a strange way, Zubul is as equally important as she is unimportant, as throughout most of the episode, she doesn't really do anything or have many notable interactions, but near the beginning and especially the end of Fast Food Masquerade, the episode strongly pushes the character dynamic of Zubul being Gangle's only friend. Be it her giving Gangle the mask, to Zubul being visibly concerned for Gangle's well-being, and a fantastic comfort scene where Zubul reassures Gangle. After this episode, it's going to be really hard to hate Zubul, as underneath her abrasive exterior, she is revealed to be one of the most compassionate characters in the show, and it does wonders for her character. At first, I didn't like this change, as just like in the last episode, it seems like the Amazing Digital Circus is trying really hard to make Zubul into a sympathetic character, and the lack of any hints that she cares for Gangle in previous episodes makes this development of hers feel like it comes out of nowhere, and as a byproduct feels artificial, but looking at how this hidden aspect of her personality benefits her character, as a whole, it works. A little ham-fisted, sure, but it works, and Zubul finally feels like an interesting character because of it. Another character who feels like she did nothing throughout the episode but still becomes a more interesting character by the end of the episode was Ragatha. Perhaps for the first time in the series, Ragatha is unapologetically saying what she truly thinks, and we learn quite a bit about her, like her being jealous of Gummy Goo for taking Pomni's attention, the possibility she used to be a farm girl who owned some horses, and that she truly does just hate Jax. These are all fun facts about her character that make her more interesting lore-wise, but again, just like Zubul, she doesn't really do much in the episode, which is a shame because the stupid sauce joke was a fun idea, but it never feels like it reached its full potential and was a kind of half-baked concept, as Ragatha is a completely passive character, and in an episode that could have used some more over-the-top humor or action, Ragatha being intoxicated could have provided plenty moments like that, but never did. Accompanying Ragatha and acting uncharacteristically, this is the first episode where Pomni feels like she has a fairly minor role and isn't a nervous disaster. Unfortunately, while this episode does make the most of the material she is given, she's not given that much, as just like every episode beforehand, she is separated from the cast. I know that the format this show is going for is for each episode to focus on one character, but in this episode, Pomni is so removed that she never even notices that Ragatha is intoxicated, has a singular exchange with Jax, and has no noteworthy interaction with Zubul. This is a very odd decision because one of this episode's biggest strengths is how each character interacts with each other at some point, but Pomni, the main character, is the exception. Still, the meaningful interactions she does have with Gengal, as she just shows simple acts of kindness and tries to show Gengal that she cares for her well-being, continues to make Pomni a better character, and I can't help but root for her in the future because with everything she's been through, and the fact that she still treated Gengal with kindness even after Gengal interrupted her conversation with Gummigoo and talked down to her, made her earn my respect, and I consider myself invested in seeing what the future holds for her. But of course, it wouldn't be a digital circus review if I didn't bring up Gummigoo, who returns in this episode, and I actually really liked his scenes. Seeing Pomni desperately try to interact with Gummigoo was adorable while simultaneously sad, as throughout her interactions with him, she has to accept that he doesn't remember her, which is heartbreaking, as Pomni very obviously admires Gummigoo and sees him as her best friend. I don't think these scenes by any means make up for Candy Carrier Chaos, but if he continues to be a reoccurring character, this could set up a fairly interesting arc for Pomni, and with how random this show is, having a consistent arc could add something to look forward to, as Digital Circus has barely had any multi-episode spanning plot hooks to keep the viewer invested. We also have Jax, who isn't anything special. The only thing he really has going for him is constantly checking the time and being miserable, and while the checking the time thing can be extremely relatable, Gengal already had him beat at the whole being miserable thing. But he does have this great standout scene where he just has a casual chat with Pomni, revealing that he becomes much less mean-spirited when he's tired or depressed, which reveals a bit about his character, while establishing how untrusting Pomni is of Jax, which put a great spotlight on their dynamic. Now on to the true main character of the episode, Gengal. It's bizarre how simple Gengal is as a character, but Fast Food Masquerade gave us so much to unpack. We finally get to see what she's like with her comedy mask on for an extended period of time, and the final result is that she's just straight up annoying. Between how Gummigoo is handled in this episode and what Gengal is like when she has her mask, the stab of irony as I reflect on my previous statements on these two characters is hurting pretty bad right now. So yeah, I didn't like Gengal when she had her mask on, but that's not a negative, as it's obviously supposed to be intentional, as Jax and Ragatha said what the viewer was probably thinking throughout those scenes. But as we get into the later half of the episode and we see her break down, we get to see the full extent of just how depressed she really is, and it hits hard. Sure, Gengal was annoying, but seeing her slowly realize that people like her less when she's happy than when she's sad must be such a horrible epiphany to have, and it's heartbreaking. The line when she says that her comedy mask is usually broken by now doesn't say much on the surface, but on a deeper level, Gengal is subtly implying that she's better off when her mask is broken because that's her most natural and comfortable state. This is why, despite her still being sad at the end of the episode, she smiles because that's who she truly is. And she doesn't have to put on a mask that represents something she's not. It's a very nuanced way to present depression, as depression is something that almost always has a negative connotation around it, but it's far worse to be depressed and pretend to be happy than just embracing that depression unapologetically. It's an incredibly bittersweet ending for Gangle, as the viewer may want her to be happy, but at the same time we know how annoying she is when she is happy, so we want her to go back to being sad, and that's what she's content with being. So the sad ending for Gangle in this instance was in actuality the happiest. Now, all that being said, I have a hard time seeing where this character can go from here, as her accepting being sad is the opposite of creating an arc or potential for further growth for her character. So if this is all the development we are going to see from her outside of having a great character design and an interesting gimmick, I just don't find Gangle to be all that interesting of a character. Yes, I do find the revelation she goes through in this episode extremely interesting, but like I said, with no setup for further development, and if she's just going to continue being the way she is now, ironically enough, I now would prefer if her future screen time is kept to a minimal. Speaking of minimal, I also want to give a brief appreciation to how this episode handled Kinger. I know some people may be disappointed by his exclusion, but possibly the most common complaint about this show is that the cast is too large, and due to his absence, that saves some screen time that is given to the rest of the cast, which I found to be a fair distribution after he got so much screen time in the prior episode. I love how interactive the characters are with each other in this episode, but it's held back by the fact that most of the characters don't live up to their potential. Jax, Ragatha, and to an extent Pomni just don't do much throughout the episode and are fairly uninteresting, and Gangle, while being interesting in this episode, feels like a dead-end character, and the only character who feels like she really benefited from the development in this episode was Zubul. For being such a character-focused episode in such a cramped setting, you would expect the character interactions to be better than what they turn out to be. For the most part, the entire episode suffers severely because of that. There are some ideas that Fast Food Masquerade tried to add a little more substance to this episode, but those ideas end up being some of the worst parts of the episode. The concept of inflicting punishments on the cast if they get low scores for their participation at the end of each adventure is exactly what this show has been needing, as outside of abstracting, there really isn't any motive for the characters to interact with the adventure the way they are supposed to, and could lead to plenty of interesting scenes or scenarios where the characters might act uncharacteristically for the sake of raising their score or reducing someone else's. But although I love this idea, at the same time, this episode, the episode where this idea was introduced, completely undermined and wasted the concept. You see, Ragatha is a constant liability throughout Fast Food Masquerade, and despite contributing absolutely nothing and just getting in people's way, she still doesn't get punished.
Well, if you underperform now, you might end up hurt later.
Well, that's gonna knock your overall score down to a B+. How's that sound?
I may like Ragatha, but that doesn't mean I want her to be exempt from following the same rules as everyone else, and in this episode, she showcased textbook behavior of how not to act while working, and for this episode to introduce punishments and not even have anyone get punished, despite Ragatha being the perfect person to make an example out of, to give the viewers an idea of what these punishments will be, isn't only a missed opportunity, but comes across as sheer incompetent writing, as Ragatha getting away with acting the way she did without being punished trivialized this entire idea and made it seem like Gooseworks just forgot to follow up with doing anything with it. And this isn't the only idea that failed with its execution, as there is a horror scene later in the episode that just felt unfinished. Now, I want to make it clear that during Jax's employee evaluation, I loved the moment when he was watching the recording of Gangle, and then Gangle drops her manager act and addresses him directly. It wasn't exactly scary per se, but the sheer creepiness, delivery, and build up to that moment is exactly my style of horror, where instead of it being a sudden jump scare or an overly disturbing visual, it's more subtle and purely unsettling. But it was only that specific moment, as the rest of Jax's evaluation scene is probably the worst, and more importantly, most unnecessary scene in Fast Food Masquerade. It's very similar to the punishments where it was a good idea with no follow through whatsoever. One would expect for Jax effectively being tortured, with the scene leaving a minor cliffhanger of him being brainwashed, to have consequences on his character, but bafflingly, it had so little of an effect on him that almost instantly after he leaves, he shrugs off the entire experience and goes back to business as usual. I genuinely don't understand what the thought process was behind incorporating this scene, as it wasn't scary enough for it to add any value to the episode, and it didn't have any lasting effects that mattered later, resulting in it feeling like a completely pointless sequence that took me out of the viewing experience, as it left me wondering, what was the point of that? I guess we do learn a little bit about Gengal during this scene, but that tidbit of information didn't need this entire elaborate setup just for the viewer to learn about that information, especially as that information wasn't important and doesn't come into play later in the episode. And that's about it. That's the majority that Fast Food Masquerade has to offer. Disappointing character interactions, failed concepts and ideas, and with how slow this episode was paced, I can already tell that many people are going to say that this episode was boring, and I can completely understand that sentiment. In fact, the most interest I ever had during my first watch through Fast Food Masquerade was that it was so uneventful that my interest was actually piqued as I wanted to see where the episode was going, but it didn't go anywhere, and I couldn't help but feel a little dissatisfied once the credits started rolling. But even though I have so little to say about this entry that was actually positive, I still think there is something below its surface that is truly special. In multiple of my videos, I have stated that an indie animated project should be entertaining first and foremost, and if it isn't, then said project is fundamentally flawed. But despite the lack of events, slow pacing, and not being all that entertaining, I can't honestly say that I was bored by this episode and that I didn't enjoy it. If you ask me, art has two purposes: to provoke thought or emotion, and if said art can do those things, then I consider it effective at fulfilling its purpose. And Fast Food Masquerade met both of those criteria. I don't think I have ever watched an episode of indie animation that felt as relatable as this episode was. If you have ever worked a customer service job, then you have probably experienced how absurd humanity can behave, and by reflecting that experience in a show that's greatest theme is absurdity, it resulted in one of the most accurate depictions of what an average workday can feel like to some people, and the wide range of emotions relatability can provoke in a person makes this episode emotionally varied depending on the individual watching it. Not only that, but in the final third of the episode, once Gengal becomes depressed, can become uncomfortably relatable as well, further strengthening the emotional impact Fast Food Masquerade can have on the viewer. So there is no argument to be made that this episode didn't make me feel something, and if you can't relate, I strongly urge you to try to watch this episode 5 years from now, as you have gained more life experience and maybe you will understand what I am talking about. But like I said, art can serve two purposes, the other being provoking thought. I'll admit it, it took me multiple viewings to fully understand the meaning behind the scene after Gengal gets off her shift, and my thoughts on the scene went through at least 3 different variations before resting on my final interpretation of its meaning. This could have been just me, but I really was confused by that scene and the deeper meaning of Pomni and Gengal's conversation that I had to think for a while until I was confident in what to say about those moments, and I really enjoyed that experience as I love shows that rely on the viewer to spend some time pondering the deeper meaning behind some of its iconography and dialogue. So Fast Food Masquerade made me think and feel, and if you ask me, that makes it a valuable piece of indie animation, no matter how entertaining it was. So when people say this episode was boring, I can understand why one might say that, but I couldn't disagree more, But on the other hand, I know there will be those people who say it's a hidden gem or a misunderstood masterpiece, which it really isn't, as most of my praises I just presented really only shine through as well as they did in the last third of the episode when it becomes dinner time, and any product that is only 30% impressive doesn't deserve to be labeled as a masterpiece, especially when so much about this episode just wasn't all that impressive. Sure, there were moments before the dinner segment that were good, but if you cut out the dinner portion of this episode, it would by no means be bad, but it didn't do much that was praiseworthy enough to compensate for how mundane this entry was. Fast Food Masquerade has many problems. Its pacing is slightly too slow, the character interactions are substandard, there are multiple concepts that aren't followed upon or mishandled. It's not very entertaining as it lacks action, horror, and is the least comedic episode in the series thus far, and there's no real climax, which could result in some feeling like the episode was pointless and without direction. But despite all those problems, I still enjoyed my time with it, even though I wouldn't label it as a good product of indie animation. But that's not to say it's bad, more that it's just under average. It's very pedestrian, but I think that is the point. It's supposed to be unremarkable, it never tries to be anything it isn't, and that's why the entire episode doesn't feel like a failure or a disappointment. From the moment it's decided that the adventure would take place in a fast food restaurant, the viewer should have had their expectations lowered. Yes, there is still room for disappointment, mainly with the characters and lack of any real climax, but by the time it hits the 6 to 8 minute mark, you should have an idea for the type of episode you are in for. But where Fast Food Masquerade's true strength lies is under the surface, with its novel exploration of depression and artful display of relatability, making this mundane and unremarkable entry of the amazing digital circus one of the most unique pieces of indie animation I have ever watched.